why is it that philosophy as we know it today consists of two very antagonistic camps? In the following video, we're going to explore the contemporary era of philosophy and discover the Analytic-Continental divide that emerged within that era. We're going to explore, in doing so, these two traditions within philosophy and see how they go about doing philosophy and what the differences between the two really are. That brings us to the contemporary era. Y'all are contemporary philosophers. Congratulations. Welcome to the club. Okay, so we're going to, basically, contemporary era philosophy is synonymous with 21st and 20th century philosophy. So anything, we're going to say 1900 onwards. Okay. Well, why this new era? Well, it has to do with this schism, this division, this feud that is emerging leading into the 20th century. So like heading into 1900, kind of right before the turn of the century, you had this feud that was emerging, this schism within philosophy, and it more or less boils over right at the turn of the century. And so that's kind of the impetus then for us suggesting that a new era of philosophy began, right? Well, what is this division? What is this schism all about? What are these two camps or traditions fighting over? And for better or worse, by the way, it's still palpable, just as palpable, still as influential, this division, to this day as it was when it first erupted 100 plus years ago, right? So when you guys realize how enamored you become with philosophy towards the middle and the end of the semester, you're going to be like, man, maybe I really want to go study this and get a degree in it. Well, this is actually going to affect perhaps where you're going to move to go study then, because as I mentioned here, there is a geographical correlation too, right? So again, let's go back though. What is this feud all about? Well, actually, it gets really to the heart of philosophy itself. It's a debate about what even the essence of philosophy is and what philosophy should look like in terms of the methodology. Like, how should we go about doing philosophy? What's most imperative or important, right? So they're really fundamental disagreements is kind of what I was getting at here, right? So let me try to characterize the disagreement here. So the analytics, and if we had an analytic philosopher in here, and conversely, if we had a continental philosopher, I don't subscribe to either. I don't label myself as either. They're probably going to disagree with some of these characterizations, but I'm just trying to give you a rough idea of what each of these kind of camps thinks. Okay, so the analytic camp is roughly, right, a camp that suggests, look, these so-called problems in philosophy, these significant philosophical problems that we think we have, really they're overstated. And in fact, if we just reflect enough, what we will figure out is that really we're the cause of most of these so-called philosophical problems. That really, if we just became better thinkers and speakers, right, the issues arise because we have such crappy thinking and speaking. So if we just became better thinkers and speakers, we would see these so-called problems of philosophy sort of dissipate or disappear entirely. And so what do we need to do? Right? If the problem is not thinking and speaking well enough, well, what's their focus and emphasis going to be on then? Better thinking and speaking. So what does that mean? Language and logic, right? Logic is all about good thinking, right? And trying to have it and eliminating the bad thinking. Okay? So no surprise then, right? If they think the root of all problems in philosophy, or for the most part, right, it boils down to our inability to think and speak clearly, well then to rectify those problems, what do we need to do? Become better thinkers and speakers. Take some logic classes. So I'll see you guys all in Philosophy 103 next semester. Right? Become better speakers, communicators, so maybe some English classes, or a lot of philosophy classes, right? Because we become better writers in philosophy, right? So a huge emphasis on language and logic. Right? Now the Continentals, they're like, well, hold up, nuh-uh. It doesn't matter how good we become at speaking and thinking, there are still going to be these significant, substantial philosophical problems that don't disappear. So it doesn't matter what degree we perfect our thinking and speaking, you're never going to be able to tell me why there's something and not nothing. What happens when we die? What's really going on? Right? There are these significant philosophical problems that no degree of perfecting our language and thinking is going to eliminate, right? So not that they dismiss the import or significance of language and logic, right? But the suggestion is, look, it's not the end-all, be-all, right? Of all of it's not going to solve all of our philosophy problems, like these guys suggest. Okay, so that again, in fairness to both those camps, all right, that's just a very rough, crude kind of characterization of each of them. I'm sure they would have problems with how I describe them. But hopefully that gives you, again, a general sort of idea. There's a lot of derision, a lot of animosity between these two camps, which is, like I mentioned earlier, still alive to this day. I'll give you relay a story here in a moment. It kind of speaks to that from my own personal experience. But you're constantly getting back and forth here. So the analytics, say, of the Continentals, their heads are in the clouds. They're too mystical. You never know what the hell they're really talking about, right? They need to be more grounded. And the Continentals will say of the analytics, they're cold-hearted, logic-chopping machines with no true appreciation of the human condition, right, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of back and forth. Oh, by the way, so one school of thought that you might have heard of that's affiliated or associated with the Continental tradition would be existentialism, okay? So again, a lot of back and forth, a lot of animosity. I've never been a fan of this schism. I don't think it does us any good, but it doesn't matter what I think, it's still there, right? And it definitely impacts things. So you might remember me saying that I have, coincidentally, a master's degree and a PhD in philosophy, one of which was at Boston College. The master's degree and the PhD is right down the road at KU. Well, what's interesting is, right, let me back up. So when you discover you want to study philosophy, right, and go to grad school for it, you're going to have to pick a team, more or less. Why? Because, for better or worse, the analytic tradition is really dominant in the United States and England, right? So if that's your team, well, stay put, right? And maybe you can get enrolled in the KU's PhD program right down the road, right? But if you instead, you really find yourself liking, some existentialists or whatever, well then you're probably going somewhere else in Europe, especially France and Germany are like the hotbeds of the Continental tradition, right? So there is this geographical correlation then, right? So you're gonna have to pick a team, unfortunately, or which one you kind of resonates with you most, and then that's probably gonna dictate where you're studying. Now, having said that, it's been a while since I've actually looked into this, at least like a decade, but I would say roughly, out of all the college philosophy departments in the United States, 90% of them are going to be associated with the analytic tradition, and only 10% are going to be associated with the Continental camp. Okay, so let's say, and again, it's been a while since I've looked into this. Let's say that there's 300 departments of philosophy in colleges and universities in the United States. That means only at most 30 are going to be associated with the Continental camp. The other 270 plus are going to be analytic. Well, as it just so happens to be the case, Boston College is very much associated with the Continental tradition. And then KU, where I went for my PhD, right, is the complete opposite. It's about as analytic as it gets. And so I witnessed firsthand just how different these traditions were, right? The teachers, how they taught classes was very, very much different. Their writing is very different, right? So if you were to read a book authored by one of the philosophers or the professors at Boston College, it's going to read totally different than a book or an article published by one of the KU instructors. Just a quick example, this makes sense, right, given what the analytics emphasize, as we mentioned earlier, logic, right? If you're going to read a journal article by one of the instructors down the road at KU, it's probably going to be, I don't know about littered, but it's going to have a lot of logical symbolism in there, a lot of logical notation, right? Whereas if you read an article by a Continental philosopher, that's a lot less likely to be the case. You're going to see a lot less stuff written in logical notation, for example. Okay, so again, for better or worse, in my mind, for the worst, right? I don't know what good any of this has done for philosophy. But regardless, right, it is every bit as tangible, appreciable, impactful to this day as it was when it first kind of erupted, this division. So again, that is the impetus for us suggesting there's this new era, call it the contemporary era, which is more or less synonymous with, again, 21st and 20th century philosophy. So we have some pretty well-known, famous names. Jean-Paul Sartre, which some of you have probably heard of. He's oftentimes associated with existentialism, even though he himself hated that label. Bertrand Russell, we're going to get to be familiar with Russell here early on in the semester, so we'll get to know him. Ludwig Wittgenstein was actually Russell's pupil for a little bit. He's a little bit lesser known outside of philosophy. Heidegger, Camus, some of us might be familiar with Camus, wrote The Myth of Sisyphus and a bunch of pretty famous novels. I actually always kind of got into Camus and his I would call it like philosophical fiction or philosophical novels. Like The Stranger, that one always got stranger every time I read it. I'm not sure that I was ever able to make any sense of it, but The Stranger, The Plague, The Rebel, some of his novels, but pretty good novelists. Derrida, Quine, we'll get to know, or we'll encounter Quine a little bit in the epistemology section. Anyway, some of the thinkers that are most notable thinkers of the contemporary era. Any questions on the contemporary era of philosophy? Now that we've explored the differences between these two major camps of philosophy in today's contemporary era, we'll go ahead and move forward to a breakdown of the traditional categories of philosophy.